this is a list of the areas of non-consumption that we've become aware of where there's either e-learning planting itself or opportunities for it to do so. Now, I think if for those of you who read Disrupt in class, we probably had 4 or 5 of these listed. Basically what's happened is that as I've traveled around the country, people come up to me occasionally and say, hey, you missed this one. So I just add another bullet. And so it's a much bigger list now than it was. But I think people are right. Like, there's just huge opportunities for online learning to make these impacts. And so credit recovery has obviously been a huge one that all of you here, I suspect, are familiar with, knowing what Plato has been able to bring to the market. But basically, in urban school districts, in many cases, it's a huge problem. Students fail a course and previously had no opportunity to make up the credit. They'd get to graduation and people would act shocked that they didn't have the requisite number of credits to graduate. Or even worse, they didn't have the learning that required to actually make progress in their other courses, and so the summer school packet or whatever they were given to get back on track just really wasn't adequate, and it would create huge problems down the line. Dropouts are obviously a huge area of non-consumption across the country. 30% of students don't graduate, we know that, but the opportunity to create alternative schools powered by online learning with way more flexible locations and hours and so forth for students and teachers is a big opportunity to meet the students where they are and start to introduce ways for them to get back on track. I'll just do one more on this, which is AP courses. That's relatively well known, that there's, 34 advanced placement courses, and I haven't come across a school yet that's able to offer all 34. But the story's way bleaker than that. 26% of our high school students in 2007 attended a high school where there were no advanced courses, period. Defined as anything above geometry, so forget about Algebra 2, forget about calculus. Defined as anything above biology, so forget about chemistry, forget about physics, and oh, by the way, the policymakers are going to tell you to solve the STEM problem. And defined as any honors English class, period. And yet, there are a couple students in each school that wanted access to those courses. Huge areas of non-consumption. And what we're seeing is that a lot of the looming budget cuts and teacher shortages, and maybe not so looming anymore, are actually, while they seem like a threat at first to how we've always done business, they actually, if we treat it differently, can be a huge opportunity to increase these areas of non-consumption, where we can actually reinvent and innovate the educational model itself in some exciting ways. So what at first seems like a threat, the really important thing for organizations is to see it as an opportunity and change your perspective. And that's how organizations are able to adapt to these disruptive innovations. Now, whenever disruptive innovation gets its start, it follows this S-curve pattern. In the early years, it sort of creeps its way in along that flat part of the S-curve. It's not real good. There's a lot of iterations and so forth, a lot of experimentation. At some point, really figure it out. People rapidly adopt it, and then it levels off at the top. The challenge is, if you're on the beginning of that S-curve, it may just be a flat line to nowhere, and no growth is going to happen at all. Or it could be a relatively steep S-curve or a slow-moving one. Turns out that there's a way to forecast the flip and figure out if an S-curve is indeed developing. And it involves doing some mathematics where you put on the y-axis the percent of the new innovation divided by the percent of the old and array it on a logarithmic axis. So 50% divided by 50% would equal 1.0. And it turns out that if an S-curve is developing, a real disruptive innovation is developing, it linearizes that S-curve when the market is just 1, 2, 3, 4%. And you can tell when it'll hit 25%, 50%, 80%, and so forth. Now, for example, homeschooling has been something that's been growing a lot. We did an S-curve calculation on it. Homeschooling doesn't grow like a disruptive innovation. It flattens out before then. So you don't see that straight line. But where we have seen that straight line is in online learning in high school, which led us to make this crazy prediction when the book came out in 2008, where we said that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion. Now, For the first 6 months, some of you may recall, people said we were nuts and crazy, and that public schools could never innovate this fast. And then something interesting happened. About 6 months after the book came out, January, February or so of '09, people came back to us and they said, we still think you're crazy. They were right, but now we think you're crazy because you were too conservative with the prediction. We think it's actually growing faster than that. I kind of plead the fifth. We're 7 years away from it now. I think we'll be right, plus or minus a couple years on either side. The data is kind of hard. It's a little obscure. A lot of districts don't want to call things e-learning when they are because it doesn't do their students any favors when they go to college. So it's kind of hard to aggregate the statistics. But it'll be roughly right, I think. What I also think, though, is that the prediction that garnered so many headlines kind of misses the point. The big opportunity with this online technology is to reinvent the model itself to solve this problem here, which is something that all educators know, but our system was not built to deal with, which is that every student has different learning needs at different times. I've just put up just a schematic of the different food fights that academics like to have about what these differences are. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but basically different academics and different universities have different theories over what the right way to think about these differences are, and then others have debunked them. So for example, learning styles is probably the most debunked way. It's not a great way of thinking about differences between students as it's currently constructed. But what people do not disagree on is that people learn at different paces. Every student brings different levels of background knowledge into a learning experience, and we all have different working memory capacities or aptitudes, and therefore can absorb information in different ways and different rates and so forth. No one disagrees on those three. And so there's a huge irony in me lecturing to you today, but putting that aside, if we agree on all those things, you would expect that if our goal is to optimize the learning for each and every single child, that we would have an education system that would customize for those different needs. And yet, our school system was literally built to standardize the way we teach and test. It was literally modeled after a factory. Started in 1843 when Horace Mann made his fabled trip to Prussia and brought back grades and classrooms and things of that nature. But literally that's how it was modeled to be, to batch students up, add value to them, and ship them out the other side. And the challenge with that is that that's not how we learn. And so our hope was that we could use this online learning not just simply to change the delivery of how we educate, but to change the education system from this monolithic one into a student-centric one that can customize for these differences. And there's huge evidence to suggest that the online technology can really readily do that, as we're talking about right now. So this is simply a screenshot from the Khan Academy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it just shows individual trajectories of student learning and the different paces at which they learn in very sharp relief over just a 90-day period or 70-day period there. And what we see is that student highlighted in blue actually started at the second to bottom of the class, and at the end of the 70 days was third to the top. But in a traditional classroom environment in the 5th grade in Los Altos, California, would have just been stuck into a specific math group and left to stay there the rest of the year. Now, what's interesting is that student is doing trigonometry in 5th grade. But we would have literally been sending the student the 5th grade curriculum practicing educational malpractice, because that's the way the system works. But thanks to online learning technology, we can very easily customize the path and pace for students. And we're seeing that take place. Now, the question is, will it realize this promise? I think there's some very optimistic notes, and I think there's a few big question marks. The optimistic notes are that, like every disruptive innovation, the technology is improving itself year over year over year. If we came here 5 years ago and I said online learning, The majority of you, I'm guessing, would have guessed distance learning is what I meant. But as you know, that's really not where this is occurring in K-12 education. It's really snapping itself into a brick and mortar environments, because just like those S-curve projections show that an S-curve is not developing in homeschool, what we're seeing is the vast majority of students, 90+%, are going to continue to go to school. They need a custodial environment there. They like to have fun with their friends, it turns out. And they like the supervision of a teacher. They like that mentoring influence. That's really, really important. And so blended learning is where the majority of this is happening. And so as a result of this growth, everyone was talking about blended learning. So we've done a lot of research. We looked at over 100 programs that were doing quote-unquote blended learning and said, what's in common with this? How do we define this? How do we make this different from tech-rich? And it was pretty clear that there were some constant characteristics. So this is our definition of blended learning, which is a formal education program in which a student learns, at least in part, through online delivery of content and instruction, in which the student has some element of control over the time, the place, the path, and/or the pace of learning, the very things that makes it disruptive and changes that model. And, at least in part, in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home, meaning a school. So it's really online learning with that student control, and school is what equals blended learning. Relatively simple, but we had to do the specific definitions. So what we do not mean by this definition is simply shoving that electronic whiteboard at the front of the classroom. What I'm doing right now is not blended learning with you. It may be online curriculum, it's not, but it may be. And, but it would not be blended learning, because I haven't given you any control over the time, place, path, and/or pace. And that model matters. Also, just because we have one-to-one laptops or digital textbooks does not make it blended learning. Those things may be important enablers of blended learning, but they're not required, and just because you have them doesn't mean it is. It's the model itself.